Hi, I'm going to continue on here and making a video in a little series, I suppose, that I've been making about drawing ellipses, different proportions, and using those ellipses in drawing cylinders, cylindrical objects, such as that, or such as that part of a coffee mug. And to review just a tad, making sure that the underlying ellipses that, oh yeah, by the way, I have this, it's okay though. The underlying ellipses for the top, this height is shorter than the underlying ellipse of the bottom, at least a little bit shorter, sometimes more than others, and the way that we're going to figure out just how much is based on perspective. So I'm going to be digging into that concept. It's going to take a couple because it's kind of tricky to make the connection between this and how this fits in with just general one-point perspective is really all I'm going to be talking about. It's true for two-point perspective as well. But real quick, so there's the idea of a circle, a cylindrical object being a combination of connected circles. And if you haven't heard this, it is true that a circle, a perfect circle, fits in a perfect square. I really hope these little visual aids are working. But what's important to start thinking about is when we're drawing the cylinder with its ellipses, it's important to be able to also think about an implied box form, square box form, that cylinder would fit inside. And from there, we're going to start shifting into understanding how the ellipse, when we use this little tool, this little technique to help draw an ellipse in a mirroring, everything sort of equal distance and stuff, fashion. Now it's time to start understanding how that relates to how that circle would fit inside a square and how that square would appear in perspective. That would be pointing towards a vanishing point. This is not a tutorial in perspective, but the tricky part comes in when we are trying to sort of combine and understand these and how they both are true at the same time. And I'm going to go a little bit deeper into explaining how and why that is, and hopefully you'll realize that it's tricky and important to understand if you really want to try to get good at ellipses, which I encourage you to get good at. The main problem that happens is the idea of sort of a trapezoidal shape to help set up perspective is probably not brand new to you, but the idea that the ellipse will go through these 4 points as well as, these 2 points is the tricky part. So hopefully I didn't just lose you all. What typically happens is you sort of say to yourself, okay, I get the idea that there's this underlying perspective shape, trapezoid shape, and I'll do my crisscross and find the center, and then I'll find the horizontal midline. And I know that the ellipse has to go through these points because that's what they told me in class, because a circle does that too. And then you'll start drawing it, and then you'll come up with a shape like this, or something like this, which is a fun shape, but it's not an ellipse. So I'm going to talk about why that is that way, and ways to combine both this and this to get to this, and understand what's going on in perspective with the ellipse. So then we'll understand how overall the proportions of it, so how overall sort of tall it will be. So I'm going to start here with just a basic sort of this idea of a trapezoid. You know, I'm gonna do that over, and I'm probably not going to edit that out, so have fun with that. I'll try to start a little bit, back up a little bit, but if you are starting the idea of a rectangle or square in perspective, there's the idea of a horizon line, vanishing point, and then these implied lines, perspective lines, that will aim towards that vanishing point. So drawing something like this and getting all detailed about making sure it is exactly a square is a very involved discussion, and not for this video. But basically, I'm going to try to get across the point that what I'm trying to draw here is a square in perspective. I have these points right here bigger than these points, so I'm trying to imply that things are going back into space until it disappears. Finishing this up, I'm going to do the midpoint here and the midpoint here, and those should go through the crisscross that I just made. So it's this portion of the little perspective setup that I'm dealing with, and therefore you're dealing with. Let's see. So try to clean this up a little bit. As you may or may not know, one of the main ideas about perspective is that things that are further away appear smaller, which is why I sort of try to, anytime I'm making one of these, I try to just add a little visual cue so that these quote-unquote points appear farther away in this drawing that hopefully is reading as something where this edge is closer, this is further, and I'm going to talk about that line too. So when you get to this point and you say, okay, I'll draw my ellipse And I've been told, and I know it has to go through this point, and this point, and this point, and this point. And then you start drawing this shape that, like I said before, really doesn't look like an ellipse, and you try to figure out, and it's frustrating and confusing. And the main idea that's going on is that when the circle does tip back in perspective, the midpoint, the literal middle, starts to appear. This portion will start to appear shorter than this portion. It's just the distance from here to here will appear smaller than the distance from here to here, even though in reality we know they're the same. So what we're going to do is go back to this technique where we're making sure that the minor axis and the major axis are going through a rectangle that would also encapsulate this ellipse. So this still coincides with the minor axis. It might actually be the minor axis. I get a little confused about that stuff, I confess. But what I'm going to do is try to find the midpoint with this giant point of this minor axis. I'm gonna try to just sort of ignore a little bit what's going on here. And I'm going to go back to trying to just identify the midpoint of this minor axis. A lot of guides and stuff going on here, so it's a little confusing, I grant you. I'm going to say that's okay. I may look closer later and figure out it's really not that close, but oh well. And then from there, I'm going to go back into this idea of drawing the major axis. But still stopping on this underlying 1-point perspective rectangle, perspective square in perspective. So this point right here represents sort of where the middle would appear. And the important thing to remember about this point is if you're drawing a cake, for example, and you have a candle right in the middle, this is where the candle will be sticking out from. If you're drawing a clock, this is where the hands will connect. But when we're trying to draw the ellipse, it's confusing, I grant you. We want to be thinking of the rectangle that is created by the major and the minor axis. Otherwise, maybe you can do it. I can't. It took me a long time to sort of try to figure out what the heck was going on with this combination of things, as well as try to figure out how to teach it. So I have both things going on here. I have the rectangle that I'm going to use to help draw my shape, my ellipse, with the major axis points ending a little bit further out than these perspective midpoints. But the wacky thing is that the ellipse goes through both of them. So it is still true that the ellipse goes through these points, but it turns out it has a little bit extra further to go because of this, the angle of the underlying perspective grid. So when I start drawing my ellipse, I'm using both ideas. I want to make sure I'm still sort of thinking about this ellipse needs to fit in an equal mirroring sort of fashion into this rectangle. And it will also go through those crisscross midline perspective points. And this, I will be eventually talking about combining the underlying perspective grids of the two different planes of a cylinder, the top plane as well as the bottom plane, which is how we're going to get to the place where we can confidently draw out accurate ellipses of different heights and make sure they're still fitting in with the underlying perspective of the drawing and making sense. So I know that that was a lot, so I'll do that perhaps one more time. So again, I'm just going to start out with a square in perspective. Real quickly, a square can take all sorts of different sort of proportions depending on where it is in the underlying grid, but something like this will be fine for now. I'm going to do my crisscross. And that tells me this point, which is the horizontal perspective midline. There's different ways of determining this vertical, but for now I'm just gonna try to find midway in here of this line is where it will fall, and this will fall midway. I am trying to make it fairly symmetrical, I would say, so this half is still a mirror image of this half. But now, instead of just sort of jumping to trying to draw an ellipse that goes through those points, these 4 points, even though it's true that they will go through those points, they'll go through additional points that I'm going to need to understand. And I'm going to understand those by breaking down this minor axis into 2 equal sections. Pretty close. Finding that midpoint for there, and from there also then sketching out the major axis. If you can sketch in the ellipse from at this point, that's great. if you're just starting, I would encourage you to try to make sure you understand both the perspective grid as well as just the underlying good old two-dimensional rectangle. That we're using to help us draw an accurate, somewhat accurate, no, wait a minute, a perfect ellipse. So that's all the underlying stuff. Jeez, all this for one ellipse? Yep. So the ellipse will go through both this point and this point. I find it easier to definitely think about the rectangle first. So that would be the underlying, the ellipse that would fit into both of these shapes. The rectangle and the perspective grid rectangular shape thing. Hopefully that makes sense. Check it out. Play the video back a bunch of times. Get out your own things, and eventually what will happen is we'll start creating drawings using a perspective point that will end up having different size underlying perspective squares in them, and from there we'll be able to draw accurate ellipses for the top plane as well as the bottom plane. I'm doing this really fast just to try to make a point. That will be for next time, but that's a good way of thinking about it and understanding why is it that this ellipse appears a little flatter, shorter from here to here than this one. More on that next video. Enjoy yourself. Enjoy yourself.